Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight, we're traveling back into the Middle Ages, a world where daily life was shaped not only by kings, knights, and battles, but also by the harsh realities of survival. And one of the most striking differences between then and now was hygiene, or rather, what people in that era understood hygiene to be. For us, cleanliness is second nature. We shower daily, brush our teeth multiple times a day, wash our clothes and machines, and expect clean running water at the turn of a tap. But for medieval people, none of these comforts existed. They lived in a world without plumbing, without reliable sewage systems, without antibiotics, and without the modern obsession with personal grooming. To step into their daily reality is to enter a place where dirt, odors, and disease were as common as bread and ale. That doesn't mean, however, that medieval people were ignorant or careless. They had their own ideas of cleanliness, shaped by religion, tradition, and necessity. Cleanliness was often linked more to spiritual purity than to health, and washing could be seen as a way to cleanse the soul as much as the body. Still, without soap factories, deodorants, or disinfectants, the standards of hygiene were radically different from what we'd consider acceptable today. Bathing, for example, was not a daily routine for the majority of people. In many parts of Europe, it was considered normal to wash the entire body only a handful of times per year, sometimes no more than a few times during major religious festivals. Instead, people relied on what we might call spot cleaning, washing the face, hands, and sometimes feet with water fetched from rivers, wells, or communal fountains. A quick splash in the morning could be enough to freshen up, even if the rest of the body hadn't been washed in months. But there was also a darker side to medieval hygiene. Waste disposal was primitive, and streets often ran with refuse. The smells of animals, smoke, and human bodies mixed into a heavy, ever-present odor that clung to towns and villages alike. For us, it might be unbearable. For them, it was simply the scent of everyday life. And yet, to paint the Middle Ages as nothing but filth would be unfair. People cared about appearances, about being presentable, and about avoiding illness even if their methods were rudimentary compared to ours. From herbal rinses to religious rituals, they found ways to make life more tolerable in a world without modern comforts. This is where our journey begins, in the heart of a society that survived, thrived, and even celebrated life despite living with standards of hygiene that would shock us today. When we think of hygiene, bathing is usually the first thing that comes to mind. But in medieval Europe, the practice of bathing was surrounded by contradiction, suspicion, and practicality. Some cultures embraced public baths, while others condemned them as places of sin. In the early Middle Ages, the tradition of Roman-style bathhouses still lingered in parts of Europe. In many towns, people could visit communal baths heated by wood-burning furnaces, where hot water was poured into large tubs or stone basins. Men and women often bathed separately, though not always something that scandalized moralists, but delighted common folk. In these places, people not only washed but also socialized, shared meals, and sometimes engaged in activities far less innocent than scrubbing the skin. For this reason, bathhouses gained a reputation as both centers of cleanliness and dens of immorality. By the later Middle Ages, attitudes began to shift. The rise of Christianity brought new ideas about the body and the soul. Bathing was sometimes viewed as vain or even dangerous, with moralists warning that too much attention to the body distracted from spiritual matters. Some even argued that frequent bathing could weaken the body, allowing illness to enter through the pores. As plagues swept through Europe, many became convinced that water itself was dangerous, carrying disease rather than washing it away. Still, ordinary people did bathe when they could. Wealthier households often had wooden tubs that could be filled with buckets of heated water. Servants carried the water, mixed in herbs such as rosemary, sage, or lavender, and sometimes added oils or petals for fragrance. A bath like this was a luxury, not a daily habit, and was often reserved for special occasions, religious festivals, or visits from important guests. For the poor, bathing was far simpler, if it happened at all. They might wash in rivers or ponds during warmer months, or simply use a damp cloth to wipe away dirt. In crowded cities, some people relied on public bathhouses that offered quick, cheap washes. Others lived their whole lives with only the most minimal of cleansing, accepting a level of dirtiness that we today would find unimaginable. Interestingly, some medieval physicians recommended dry washing, rubbing the body with linen cloths or powders made from ground herbs and flowers. This absorbed sweat and left a faint scent of perfume, even if no water touched the skin. It was a compromise between cleanliness and fear, reflecting a time when water could be both friend and enemy. In short, Bathing in the Middle Ages was never routine, it was an event, shaped by class, religion, and local custom. For some, it was a rare indulgence, for others, a necessary part of life in crowded cities. But for all, it carried an aura of risk and uncertainty, where water could just as easily heal as harm. When we picture medieval hygiene, it's easy to imagine tangled hair, rotting teeth, and grimy faces, and while these images carry some truth, the reality was more nuanced. People did care about their appearance, sometimes out of health concerns, but more often for reasons of status, religion, or simple vanity. Hair care was especially important. Both men and women often wore their hair long, and without regular washing. It required constant attention. Combs, carved from bone, wood, or horn, were common personal items. Even peasants often carried them. Lice were a near universal problem, so combing was not just cosmetic but essential. Wealthier women sometimes rinsed their hair with mixtures of herbs, vinegar, or even lye soap, hoping to keep it fresh and glossy. Some records describe remedies made from rosemary, nettles, or chamomile, meant to strengthen hair and ward off pests. Men's grooming varied by time and place. Beards were sometimes grown long, sometimes kept neatly trimmed, depending on fashion or religious expectations. A knight or noble might spend considerable time having his hair oiled and his beard shaped. For the poor, a knife or shears did the job quickly, less about style, more about practicality. Dental care, however, was far more primitive. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist, but people used twigs, cloths, or even their fingers with abrasive powders to scrub their teeth. Crushed herbs, ashes, or salt were common ingredients. Peppermint, sage, and cloves might be chewed to freshen the breath, though tooth decay was widespread. For the wealthy, sugar was a growing luxury, and with it came the rise of cavities. Dentistry was rudimentary at best. Teeth that hurt were pulled out, often with crude tools, sometimes by barbers rather than doctors. Skin care was equally a blend of necessity and vanity. People wiped their faces with linen cloths, used rosewater or vinegar rinses, and sometimes applied ointments made from animal fat mixed with herbs. Fair, clear skin was admired among the wealthy, since it showed a life spent indoors rather than toiling in the sun. Peasants, naturally, bore tans, calluses, and rough skin that told of their labor. Cosmetics did exist: powders, rouges, and perfumes, but their use was often criticized by the church, which warned against vanity and unnatural beauty. Even so, the desire to appear presentable was universal. Whether through a comb carried in a peasant's pocket, a noblewoman's scented oils, or a knight's carefully trimmed beard, medieval people tried, in their own ways, to control the human body's stubborn refusal to stay clean. Their tools were crude, their science limited, but the impulse was timeless, to fight against decay, dirt, and disorder with whatever means they had. If medieval hygiene was already difficult inside the home, it became far more complicated in the streets. Waste management was perhaps the greatest challenge of urban life in the Middle Ages. And for most towns and cities, the solution was painfully simple: dump it outside. Human waste was often collected in chamber pots, small containers kept under beds or in corners of homes. In wealthier households, servants were tasked with emptying them into cesspits or rudimentary sewers. But for the average townsfolk, the chamber pot was often emptied directly out the window and into the street below. Imagine walking through a crowded alleyway, only to hear the cry of "Gardi," a warning shouted in some places before dumping waste, and then dodging a bucket of filth splashing onto the cobblestones. Cesspits, deep holes dug to contain waste, were common in cities, but they filled quickly and often leaked into wells or streams. The stench was overwhelming, especially in summer. There are accounts of entire neighborhoods reeking of rot, where the ground itself was soaked with centuries of accumulated filth. Not surprisingly, water contamination was frequent, and outbreaks of diseases like dysentery and cholera spread with terrifying speed. Animal waste added to the problem. Horses, donkeys, pigs, and chickens all roamed city streets, leaving behind their droppings. In some towns, pigs acted as scavengers, rooting through garbage piles and eating scraps, but they also made streets dirtier. The result was an urban environment where mud, manure, refuse, and household waste blended into a thick, foul-smelling paste beneath people's feet. Odors defined medieval life. To us, the smell would be unbearable, but for them, it was simply the backdrop of existence. The aroma of smoke from wood fires mixed with the sweat of unwashed bodies, the temps of tanneries where animal hides were processed, the sharp bite of chamber pots emptied into drains, and the earthy rot of garbage piled against walls. Markets brought spices, fish, and freshly slaughtered meat, but without refrigeration, the scents quickly turned rancid. To cope, people burned incense, carried pomanders filled with herbs, or wore sprigs of lavender and rosemary pinned to their clothing. Nobles might douse themselves with perfumes imported from the East, while commoners relied on smoke from the hearth to cover odors. Even physicians believed that foul smells, miasmas, caused disease, so combating odors wasn't just about comfort, but survival. Despite the filth, medieval cities thrived. People grew used to the environment, just as we today have grown used to the hum of traffic or the glow of neon lights. The dirt was part of daily life, an accepted inconvenience in exchange for the opportunities of urban living. But it was also a silent killer, a breeding ground for plagues that would shape the course of history. In the medieval world, poor hygiene wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. The lack of sanitation, combined with limited medical knowledge, turned towns and villages into breeding grounds for disease. Illness lurked in the water people drank, in the food they ate, and even in the very air they breathed. Perhaps the most infamous example was the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, wiping out nearly half the population in just a few years. Carried by fleas living on rats, the plague thrived in filthy streets where waste, carcasses, and refuse piled high. Overcrowded homes and poor hygiene allowed it to spread like wildfire. People noticed connections, they saw that dirt and disease went hand in hand, but without understanding germs or bacteria, they had no clear explanation. Doctors of the time believed in the theory of miasma, that foul smells carried sickness through the air. This belief wasn't entirely wrong, since stench often did signal rot and contamination, but it didn't explain how microscopic organisms spread disease. To fight back, people lit bonfires, burned herbs like sage and juniper, and walked around with perfumed pouches pressed to their noses. These measures made life more bearable, but they did little to stop epidemics. Beyond plague, medieval people battled countless other diseases. Leprosy was one of the most feared, not just for its physical toll, but for the social stigma attached to it. Lepers were often forced to live in separate communities, ringing bells to warn others of their presence. Smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, and tuberculosis were constant threats, sweeping through towns with merciless regularity. Even minor wounds could turn fatal without proper cleaning, as infections spread unchecked. Interestingly, there were attempts to maintain public health measures. Some cities passed laws requiring butchers to dispose of animal waste outside the walls, or forbidding people from dumping garbage in the main streets. Monasteries often had cleaner facilities than towns, with rudimentary aqueducts and washrooms for monks. Yet these efforts were inconsistent, and the sheer density of medieval life made it nearly impossible to avoid outbreaks. Religion also shaped how people viewed illness. Many believed disease was a punishment from God, a test of faith, or the result of sin. This gave rise to processions, pilgrimages, and prayers as remedies alongside herbal treatments. While modern science might see these as futile, they provided emotional comfort in a world where sickness could strike without warning. What's most striking is that people did survive generation after generation, despite the filth and frequent epidemics. They built resilience, lived with risk as a daily companion, and adapted to an environment that seems almost unlivable by modern standards. The story of hygiene in the Middle Ages, then, is not only about dirt and disease, it's also about endurance. In the shadow of plagues, people still worked, loved, prayed, and dreamed. Life, even surrounded by death, went on. When we imagine hygiene, we often focus on the body itself, washing the skin, brushing the teeth, trimming the hair. But in the Middle Ages, clothing played just as important a role in how people managed cleanliness. After all, even if someone washed rarely, changing into fresh clothes could give the impression of being clean. For the wealthy, wardrobes were larger and more elaborate. Nobles and royalty had access to multiple sets of fine linen undergarments, tunics, and gowns, which were frequently changed and laundered. Linen, in particular, was prized for its smooth texture and ability to absorb sweat. A clean linen shirt against the skin was considered not just comfortable but also a form of hygiene, almost like a substitute for bathing. Some medieval physicians even recommended it, claiming that frequent changes of linen could draw out impurities from the body. For common folk, however, clothing was far more limited. Many peasants might own only one or two sets of garments, which were worn daily until they were too dirty to ignore. Laundry was hard work. There were no soaps as we know them, no washing machines, no convenient detergents. Clothes were boiled in cauldrons or scrubbed by hand with lye ash or harsh homemade cleaners. This process was time-consuming, physically exhausting, and tough on the fabric. Because of this, people often delayed washing as long as possible, mending worn garments repeatedly to extend their use. Public laundries and rivers also became essential parts of the hygiene system. In villages and towns, women gathered at riversides to wash clothing by beating it against stones or wooden boards, sometimes rinsing with cold water, other times using heated water when fuel was available. These gatherings were not just about laundry, they were also social events, where gossip, stories, and news spread as quickly as soap bubbles. But laundry wasn't always purely practical. For the upper classes, perfumed sachets were sometimes placed in wardrobes or sewn into clothing to mask odors. Wealthy individuals sprinkled garments with rosewater, lavender, or vinegar-based rinses to give a pleasant scent. Even without frequent baths, freshly scented clothes could make a person seem elegant and refined. Of course, there was a darker side as well. Clothing could also be a carrier of disease. Fleas and lice thrived in the seams of garments, and infestations were widespread. Delousing was a constant battle, often handled by simply picking the insects out by hand or by briefly boiling garments when possible. Travelers, soldiers, and the poor suffered most from these pests, which spread illness in armies and cities alike. Still, clothing functioned as a kind of protective shield. It absorbed dirt, sweat, and even disease from the body, and when washed or changed, it gave at least a temporary sense of renewal. In many ways, medieval hygiene was less about the body itself and more about the fabric that touched it. So while baths were rare and soap scarce, a freshly laundered tunic or a new linen shift could offer not only comfort, but dignity, as small defense against the dirt and dangers of the medieval world. If personal cleanliness was already a struggle in the Middle Ages, the challenge of keeping entire towns and cities clean was even greater. To walk through a medieval city was to enter a world of sights, sounds, and especially smells that would overwhelm our modern senses. Streets were narrow, often muddy, and rarely paved. Rain quickly turned them into rivers of muck, and in dry weather, dust clung to skin and clothing alike. But the true problem wasn't mud or dust, it was waste. With no modern sewage systems, human and animal refuse was a constant presence. Chamber pots were emptied directly into the streets, sometimes with a shouted warning, sometimes without. Horses, donkeys, pigs, and cattle shared the same space as people, leaving behind piles of dung that were only occasionally cleared away. The result was an urban environment saturated with odor, the stench of waste mixed with the smoke of hearth fires, the tang of tanneries, the pungency of fish markets, and the damp mustiness of tightly packed houses. To modern noses, it would have been unbearable. But to those who lived there, it was simply the background of daily life. Smell was not just tolerated, it was expected. Of course, authorities tried to impose order. In many towns, laws were passed, requiring butchers to work outside city walls, since animal blood and entrails quickly polluted streets. Tanneries, which used urine and rotting matter in their processes, were also pushed to the outskirts. Some cities even paid laborers to cart waste away, dumping it into rivers or pits. Yet these efforts were never enough to keep up with the sheer volume of filth produced by growing populations. Water sources often suffered as a result. Wells and streams near towns could easily be contaminated, leading to outbreaks of disease. People often preferred ale or weak beer to water, believing it safer to drink, and, in many cases, they were right. But the medieval street was not just a place of dirt and disease, it was also alive with color and activity. Merchants sold bread, meat, and cloth from wooden stalls. Entertainers performed for coins. Neighbors chatted from doorways. Children played among the chaos, darting past carts and animals. The noise, the stench, the movement, all of it created a kind of raw vitality that made medieval cities both dangerous and vibrant. And hygiene, in this environment, became as much about survival as about cleanliness. People navigated the streets carefully, avoided foul-smelling corners, and trusted their senses to warn them of danger. Smell, in particular, was seen as a guide. Foul air was believed to spread disease, so avoiding bad odors was thought to be a form of protection. In the end, the medieval city was a paradox. It was a hub of trade, art, and community, but also a place where filth was unavoidable and where the battle against dirt was constant, endless, and often lost. In the medieval world, the connection between hygiene and health was understood in ways that feel both strangely familiar and profoundly alien to us today. People knew that filth, foul smells, and stagnant air made them sick, but they often misunderstood why. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, Explanations for disease rested on theories of humors, miasmas, and even divine punishment. One of the most widespread medical ideas of the time was the theory of the four humors, inherited from ancient Greek medicine. According to this view, health depended on maintaining balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to arise when one humor dominated the others. Hygiene practices, therefore, were sometimes seen not as a way to remove germs, but as a way to restore balance. A hot bath, for instance, might be prescribed to open the pores and let excess humors escape. Another dominant belief was in miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused disease. Foul smells from waste, rotting food, or swampy ground were seen as physical dangers, poisoning anyone who inhaled them. In times of plague, people carried posies of herbs, wore pomanders filled with spices, or burned incense in their homes. These scents weren't just pleasant, they were thought to cleanse the air, pushing away the invisible poisons of disease. When the Black Death struck in the 14th century, killing millions across Europe, the connection between filth and illness became impossible to ignore. But lacking germ theory, people drew the wrong conclusions. Some blamed outsiders or divine wrath. Others doubled down on miasma theory, purging streets with fires, spreading herbs across floors, or avoiding baths altogether for fear that open pores would invite in the plague. Doctors of the time often wore long robes and, later, the iconic plague masks shaped like birds' beaks stuffed with aromatic herbs. These were less protection than symbolic armor, yet they reflected the same belief, that smell itself was the enemy. Ordinary people, too, took what precautions they could. They washed hands and faces more often during outbreaks, fumigated homes with burning juniper or rosemary, and avoided crowded places when fear was high. Even without modern science, they recognized that cleanliness and fresh air gave them a better chance at survival. Still, the medieval relationship with hygiene was contradictory. Bathhouses, once popular, were increasingly abandoned during plague years, blamed for spreading disease. Physicians argued about whether water healed or harmed, while peasants clung to traditional remedies passed down through families. Religion added another layer, teaching that sickness could be a form of penance or punishment and that spiritual purity mattered as much as physical cleanliness. In this world, hygiene wasn't just about washing or waste. It was about the eternal struggle to ward off sickness, to survive in the face of forces barely understood. And in that struggle, every habit, whether bathing, burning herbs, or simply avoiding bad smells, became a fragile shield against the unknown. When we imagine medieval hygiene, we usually think about bodies and bathhouses, but there was another, often overlooked, dimension to cleanliness: clothing. In a world where frequent bathing was rare, what people wore and how often it was washed played a crucial role in how clean they felt and appeared. For most people, laundering clothes was far from a daily activity. Washing garments required enormous effort. Without soap factories or washing machines, laundry meant hauling buckets of water, sometimes icy cold from a river, or well boiling it over a fire, and scrubbing garments by hand with ash, lye, or homemade soap. Stains were beaten out with wooden paddles or rubbed with sand. The process was exhausting, messy, and time-consuming, which meant clothes were not washed often. Instead, linen undergarments carried the burden of hygiene. These light tunics, or shifts, worn closest to the skin, absorbed sweat and dirt. Outer garments made of wool or heavy fabrics were washed infrequently, but underclothes were changed and laundered more often. For peasants, having two sets of linen was already a luxury, one to wear while the other was washed and drying. Changing into fresh linen gave the sensation of cleanliness, even if the body itself had indeed been fully bathed. The wealthy, of course, could afford more. Nobles had wardrobes of fine fabrics and servants to wash them. They also made use of scented oils, powders, and perfumes sprinkled onto clothes to mask odors. Bright, unstained garments were a symbol of prestige, signaling not only wealth but also refinement. To appear in court with dingy or unkempt clothes was to risk humiliation, no matter how many jewels one wore. Laundry itself was often communal. In towns, washerwomen worked along riversides, slapping garments against stones while gossiping and sharing news. In villages, women might gather weekly to launder together, making the hard labor into a social ritual. Despite the difficulty, clean linens brought a sense of renewal, both physical and emotional. There was pride in crisp, white fabric drying in the sun. Interestingly, medieval people recognized that clean clothes could improve health. Physicians sometimes recommended fresh linen as part of a recovery routine, believing that dirty fabrics harbored corruption that could worsen illness. And in truth, While they didn't understand germs, they weren't entirely wrong. Lice, fleas, and parasites thrived in unwashed garments, spreading disease. Changing into fresh linen reduced these risks, even if medieval people couldn't explain why. For the poor, however, clothing was often patched, repatched, and worn until it fell apart. Washing was rare, and odors clung stubbornly. Yet even in the humblest homes, there was a desire for neatness. Rags were washed, dried, and mended with care. In a society where appearances carried meaning, even the smallest attempt at clean clothing mattered. So, while medieval people may not have bathed daily, they fought their battles for cleanliness through fabric, soap made from ash and animal fat, and the quiet ritual of laundry. In many ways, clothing became a second skin, one that carried both the dirt and dignity of its wearer. If personal hygiene in the Middle Ages was already complicated, public hygiene was an even greater challenge. Medieval towns and cities grew rapidly, often without planning, and waste management systems lagged far behind. The result was a world where the line between living spaces and filth was thin, sometimes non-existent. Streets in many towns were narrow, crowded, and muddy, without proper drainage. Rain mixed with animal dung, refuse, and human waste, turning roads into foul-smelling rivers of filth. Residents would toss chamber pot contents directly out of their windows, shouting warnings to passers-by below. It was a normal part of daily life, and no one thought twice about it. Larger cities made attempts to control the chaos. Some had primitive gutter systems that carried waste away, though they often clogged or overflowed. Privies, cesspits, and latrines were constructed, but they required constant cleaning, and when neglected, they overflowed into streets or rivers. In London, Paris, and other great cities, authorities occasionally passed laws requiring people to clean the areas in front of their homes, but enforcement was uneven. Markets added another layer of dirt. Animals were slaughtered in open stalls, their blood running into the cobblestones. Fish, meat, and vegetables were sold without refrigeration, leaving behind piles of rotting scraps. The stench was overwhelming, but for medieval city dwellers, it was simply part of the landscape of daily survival. Despite the filth, there were also efforts to control it. Guilds of street cleaners, nightmen, and gong farmers worked to empty cesspits, remove waste, and keep cities somewhat livable. These jobs were dangerous and stigmatized, yet they were essential. Without them, cities would have drowned in their own refuse. Rivers and wells, vital sources of drinking water, were often polluted by sewage. People noticed that bad water made them sick, but they lacked the scientific understanding to explain why. As a result, beer and ale became staples of daily life, often safer to drink than water itself. In a sense, the medieval pint wasn't just a pleasure, it was a survival strategy. So while castles and cathedrals reached for the heavens, the streets below told another story, one of mud, waste, and constant human struggle against an environment they only partly controlled.